The year is 1942. The vast Soviet territory seems to be burning from end to end. The flames of war consume cities, towns, and hopes. The roads are covered with endless columns of refugees, women dragging children, old men staggering through the snow, while behind them the distant sound. That metallic thunder announces the arrival of the German forces. A Wehrmacht advances mercilessly. Each dawn brings worse news. Kiev, Smolensk, Kharkov, they all fall one by one, like blood-stained dominoes. The skies are always covered with smoke, and the smell of burnt oil and human flesh mixes with the frozen air, as Soviet forces are on edge. Many fighters have no boots, no ammunition, just fear. The enemy seems unstoppable. Poorly trained soldiers are sent to the front with one rifle for every 2 men. When one falls, the other picks up the weapon, and the dry sound of German machine guns cuts through the air, mowing down entire ranks before they even get close. The chaos is total. Between muddy trenches and scattered bodies, thousands of Soviets begin to desert. Others hide in the forests, throwing away their helmets and uniforms, hoping to survive another day. But there is something even worse than the enemy ahead: the fear of the Soviet army itself. Behind the lines, firing squads wait in silence. If a soldier retreats without orders, he is shot. If you hesitate, you are considered a traitor. And for many, this cold-blooded execution, carried out by their own countrymen, is more terrifying than death at the hands of the Germans. In this scenario of despair and blood, something emerges as merciless as war itself. The Soviet High Command needs a solution, something that restores fear, discipline, and control. And Stalin finds the answer, not in heroism, but in punishment. Men deemed unworthy to carry the red flag, cowards, deserters, thieves, punished officers, will all be rounded up and thrown back into hell. This is how the Penal Battalions, the Calls Feinbats, these battalions did not fight for glory. They did not fight for their country. They fought for something more primitive, a chance to live. And the motto that guided them, engraved on official orders and whispered among the ranks, was simple and cruel. Through the blood, you will wash away your guilt. From that moment on, the war in the East ceases to be just a fight between armies. It becomes a fight between death and human despair. Stalin's order, Decree number 227, not one step back, July 1942. The news travels through the Soviet army like an icy blast. Stalin himself signed a new order. The paper, dated July 28th, carries words that will change the fate of millions. Its title is dry and bureaucratic, but the content is a death sentence. Order number 227, not a step back. The commanders read aloud before their exhausted and hungry troops. The wind carries their voices, mixing them with the distant sound of artillery. Every sentence is a blow. The homeland is in danger. Every meter lost is a betrayal. Anyone who retreats without orders will be considered a deserter and shot on the spot. The men listen, silent. Some look at the ground. Others grip their rifles with trembling hands. They understand perfectly there is nowhere left to run. From that day on, the Soviet army created a new type of unit, the blocking companies, composed of soldiers from the NKVD, Stalin's political police. They are not there to fight the Germans, but their own. They march behind the front lines, weapons ready, waiting for the first coward to dare take a step back. And when that happens, the report of the rifles echoes dryly, without hesitation. Nobody runs away, no one backs down. The fear of the Soviet bullet is now greater than the fear of German machine guns. The entire army is being pushed by the force of terror. Starving men without ammunition are forced to attack, to resist, to die, not out of courage, but because behind them are Russians ready to kill them if they hesitate. And, while the front burns on Stalingrad, Voronezh and Rzew, Stalin watches from afar, cold, calculating. He knows his army is bleeding, but he also knows that panic is contagious. and that if he doesn't control it, he will lose the war. So your logic is brutal. If fear of the enemy is not enough, then fear of the state itself is. This order creates a new caste of soldiers. Those who erred, who faltered, who surrendered to despair, now have a chance for redemption, a bloody and nearly impossible chance. They will not fight side by side with others. They will be separated, isolated, and sent on the most suicidal missions. Thus, officially, the Soviet Penal Battalions, formed not by heroes, but by men whom the state had already condemned to death. But ironically, it would be they who, in the following months, would change the course of the war, paying the price with their own blood. Subscribe, never miss a documentary. And then, the unthinkable takes shape. In makeshift tents, on the banks of the Volga, and in the ruins of devastated cities, commissars and officers begin to gather the condemned men. Some come straight from the prison camps, still with the marks of the chains on his wrists. Others were torn from their own ranks for retreating, disobeying an order, losing their weapon, or simply looking in the wrong direction at the wrong time. These men are the penalties, the soldiers of the penal battalions, a force made of human remains, of those who lost everything, even the right to be called a soldier. When they arrive at the meeting point, they find a scene that looks like something out of a nightmare. Stacks of uniforms with no ranks, no insignia, no flags, no symbols of honor. The officers look at them with contempt and even fear. They are the worst, the curses of the Red Army. But there is something even more terrible, on promise. The commander reads aloud with the bureaucratic tone of someone issuing a sentence. If they survive 6 months of active combat, their feathers will be erased. If they die in the line of duty, they will be remembered as soldiers who did their duty. Most people get the message. 6 months, but no one believes he will live even 6 days. Penal battalions are formed in a hurry. Many have only hundreds of men, almost always commanded by officers who were also punished. These officers, once respected, now share the same fate as the criminals and deserters they once condemned. Without insignia, without names, the Shtrafniki are sent straight to hell. They receive old weapons, rusty rifles, and very little ammunition. Sometimes just 1 porter per man, sometimes not even that, and the unluckiest march with a shovel or a bayonet, hoping to grab a weapon from a fallen comrade. But despite the abandonment, something pulses between them, the will to survive. They know they are expendable, but as long as they breathe, there is still hope. And each of them, deep down, dreams of erasing their shame with the only resource. They still have one's own blood. As night falls, in the mud and snow-soaked trenches, the Shtrafniki look to the horizon and hear the distant roar of German tanks. Some pray. Others drink what's left of the vodka, and the younger ones tremble in silence, because they know that when the sun rises, they will be the first to advance, the first to die, and the last to be remembered. Soviet hell had just gained its servants, and history would never see anything like it. Click to follow the story to the end. Dawn arrives cold and silent. The new penal battalions prepare to depart, but the scene is almost grotesque. Instead of clean, shiny uniforms, what they get are rags sewn together in haste, clothes stained with dried blood, bullet holes and coats of arms torn off with a knife. No insignia, no name. They do not belong to any regiment. They are ghosts within the army itself. The boots, when there are boots, are punctured, hardened by ice. Some march with rags wrapped around their feet, others with civilian shoes taken from the dead. The cold cuts the skin like blades, and yet they walk. In the weapons distribution line, the absurdity is complete. Old boxes, stacked and covered in grease, are opened before the men. Inside, Mosin Nagant rifles of World War I, some with a cracked stock, others without a bayonet. The magazines are empty. The officer with a tired look mutters, "The bullets are in front. Take the bullets from those who fall." This is the unwritten rule of penal. Battalions survive to inherit the ammunition of the dead man next door. As German artillery begins to thunder in the distance, they receive the final details. The mission is simple and deadly. Advance, test the defenses, find out where the enemy is hiding, or in other words, go ahead and die first. The Shtrafniki march, their rifles dangling from their hands, their eyes fixed on nothing. Some laugh, a nervous, joyless laugh. Others sing softly, old songs from when they still believed war had heroes. The regular soldiers watching them leave look away. No one wishes good luck, no one raises a fist, because everyone knows that within an hour, maybe less, those men will no longer exist. The wind blows cold, carrying the smell of smoke and death. The ground is hard, covered in a thin crust of ice and mud, and between each step, the dry sound of cracked boots echoes like a funeral clock. These men do not march for the homeland. They march because behind them there are Soviet bullets, and ahead there is only the unknown and the inevitable. And when the first enemy shot pierces the air, they don't duck. They advance because they know that for them there is no retreat. Join. Real history, no glorification. The winter of 1942 falls on the front of Erasure like a curse. The wind cuts like blades, the snow is knee-deep, and the horizon is a mixture of white, smoke, and death. There, in the soggy forests and ice-covered fields, the Red Army attempts the impossible, to push the Germans. Back, and ahead of everything, Shtrafniki. It's dawn. The sky is still dark, but the men are already in position. The ground shakes with the roar of Soviet guns opening fire. The explosions illuminate the field in orange flashes, revealing craters filled with bodies and twisted barbed wire. The air smells of gunpowder, mud, and burning flesh. You Penal Battalions receive the order, move forward without tank support, no artillery cover, just walk or run straight into German machine guns. An awkward silence takes over the group. An older man, with one eye covered by a dirty cloth, makes the sign of the cross. Another murmurs, "Better to die walking than to be shot in the back." And then a flute capital. Hell begins. The Shtrafniki emerge from the mist like living shadows. The snow crunches under your boots. The wind takes your breath away. But before they reach the first hill, the familiar and terrifying sound arises. The dry crack of MG-42 machine guns. A quick, cutting sound like a saw devouring living flesh. Men fall in droves. Some are thrown back by bullets. Others stumble over bodies trying to get up. The white snow turns red in seconds, but those who remain standing keep moving forward. Not by courage, but why behind them, the commissioners are ready to shoot anyone who retreats. A young soldier, poorly shaved, throws himself on the ground beside a broken log. He looks at his companion beside him. His chest is open, blood bubbles in the snow. He picks up the dead. Man's rifle loads it and runs again. The mind no longer thinks, the body just obeys. Explosions rip through the ground, grenades fall nearby, throwing mud and pieces of people into the air. The air is a continuous roar, and amidst this infernal sound, screams in Russian, in German, in nothing, just human voices shattering. At the top of the hill, one of the correctional officers raises his pistol and shouts, "By blood! By redemption!" But the bullet hits him before he can finish his sentence. He falls, arms open, as if asking the ground for forgiveness. Within hours, the attack is crushed. The Erasure countryside returns to silence, covered in bodies mixed with snow. The wind blows and erases the footprints, as if to hide the shame of what just happened. Of the 700 men who left that morning, less than 50 I was. And of those, many are too injured to continue. But the command does not write down their names, does not honor them. In the official report, a short sentence. Advance bravely executed, losses acceptable. Thus, Soviet Penal Battalions have their baptism of fire, and Erasure becomes the first altar where the condemned wash away their guilt with blood. Turn on alerts and subscribe now. After Erasure, the method is defined. The Soviet High Command learns a new way to attack, a way as simple as it is inhumane. the human waves. It's dawn again. The wind is biting and the snow-covered plains seem too silent. Behind the lines, thousands of men wait. Among them, the penalties, the condemned. Each one carries an old gun, a half-empty magazine, and a fear so deep that it no longer fits inside the body. The officers pass slowly between the ranks. They read the orders in harsh, emotionless voices. First wave advances at 5:30, second wave at 5:40, third at 5:50. No retreat. And that, men turned into numbers, in minutes, in flesh. The sky begins to lighten, and with the first glimmer of sunlight comes the roar. Soviet artillery opens fire. Cannons and rockets scream in unison, sending up flames and black smoke. The ground trembles, the air vibrates, and amidst the thunder of explosions, an order cuts through everything like a blade. Woo o Shtrafniki korum. There is no cover, no strategy, just bodies rushing en masse against the enemy, like a human tide driven by desperation. They scream, they shoot, they stumble. The first ones fall, then the seconds, and then the third parties. German machine guns respond, and the world becomes a whirlwind of blood and snow. Each gust leaves furrows of bodies on the field, men torn apart, arms ripped off, faces smashed into the ice. But the mass continues to advance. Why behind them Soviet officers and blockading companies observe. Whoever tries to retreat dies. Every 10 meters, the ground is covered with dead people. But Stalin doesn't measure casualties, he measures advance. And if one attack fails, a new wave is sent, and another, until the earth itself is satiated with blood. A German officer in his memoirs would later write, "They looked like madmen. They came in rows, even as they saw their comrades fall. They didn't stop. It was like fighting death itself, and it always came back." The strategy, however cruel, it works. The exhausted Germans are forced to retreat in the face of the absurd number of men that the Red Army is capable of sacrificing. But for the Shtrafniki, there is no victory. Those who survive are reorganized and sent out again and again and again. Every attack is a meat grinder, every victory a cemetery. And amidst the snow and smoke, what remains of these men's humanity dissolves, like the vapor of warm blood in frost. They no longer fight for the homeland, not even for redemption. They just fight to see the next sunrise, even if it is the last. As the final bursts of machine gun fire stuttered into silence and the acrid smoke of battle drifted away on the icy winds of the Eastern Front, a heavy, oppressive quiet settled over the scarred landscape outside the Soviet lines, a silence so dense it seemed to choke the very air from the lungs of those still breathing. The field, once a contested no-man's land of churned mud and snow, was now a grotesque tapestry woven with the bodies of the fallen, a sprawling mosaic of death that stretched as far as the eye could see under the leaden grey sky of February 1944. Some lay face down, their limbs splayed in awkward surrender to the earth, as if embracing the frozen ground in their final moments. Others sprawled on their backs, eyes wide open, staring blankly at a heavens they would never again behold, their pupils fixed in a permanent vigil under a canopy of clouds that offered no mercy. The snow, falling in soft, relentless flakes, began its slow work of burial, dusting the corpses with a delicate shroud that blurred features, erased identities, and muffled the last traces of humanity from men who had been stripped of everything long before their deaths. These were the penalties, the men of the Soviet Penal Battalions, the condemned, the forsaken, whose lives were spent as carelessly as bullets in a war that devoured millions, their existence erased not just by death, but by the deliberate amnesia of a regime that deemed them less than human. The penalties drawn from the gulags, prisons, and ranks of those branded as traitors, cowards, or political undesirables were the Soviet Union's sacrificial lambs, thrust into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front to atone for their supposed sins through blood. These penal battalions, known officially as Strafbat for men and Strafrot for officers, were not recorded in the meticulous ledgers of military glory that chronicled the Red Army's triumphs. Their names, if they were even known, did not grace the rolls of honor. No medals were struck for their sacrifices, no songs composed to immortalize their fleeting courage. When an entire battalion, sometimes 400 to 800 men strong, was obliterated in a single, suicidal charge against German machine gun nests or panzer divisions, as was often the case, the Soviet war machine simply churned on, indifferent. A new batch of condemned, political prisoners accused of counter-revolutionary activities, soldiers who had retreated without orders, or civilians swept up in Stalin's purges, would be rounded up from the sprawling Gulag archipelago, issued threadbare uniforms and obsolete rifles, and herded to the front to replace their predecessors. The dead were reduced to cold statistics in the ledgers of the People's Commissariat for Defense, their fates summarized in terse, bureaucratic prose. Mission accomplished, losses significant, or more chillingly, battalion reconstituted per command directive. These phrases, scrawled by faceless clerks in distant headquarters, were the only epitaphs the penalties would ever receive, their lives distilled to numbers that dissolved into the vast, anonymous tide of the war's body count. The Soviet state, under Stalin's iron grip, seemed intent on erasing the very existence of these men, as if their suffering were an embarrassment, a stain on the myth of the Red Army's unbreakable spirit. No monuments rose to commemorate their charges into the jaws of death. No plaques bore their names in the villages they helped liberate at the cost of their lives. Their bodies, when not left to rot in the open, were denied even the dignity of a proper grave. In the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, the penalties were expendable. Their deaths a currency spent to clear minefields, exhaust German ammunition, or mark the boundaries of enemy defenses with their corpses. In many sectors, Soviet combat engineers used the fallen as grim signposts, navigating through the carnage to trace the paths of German fire, the bodies forming macabre trails that guided the next wave of attackers. The ground, hardened by frost and saturated with blood, became a literal road of death, its surface compacted by the weight of decay and the tread of boots as fresh waves of penalties marched over the remains of their comrades, knowing they too would likely join the silent ranks by dawn. The snow, stained red and brown, froze into a grotesque pavement, a testament to the scale of sacrifice that went unacknowledged, unrecorded, and unmourned. The regular Red Army soldiers, those who fought in the standard rifle divisions or tank brigades, observed this slaughter with a mixture of pity, fear, and enforced silence. They watched from their trenches as the penalties were driven forward, often at gunpoint by NKVD, blocking detachments who stood ready to shoot any who faltered. Their Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH-41 submachine guns leveled at the backs of the condemned. These regulars, hardened by years of war, knew better than to speak of the penal battalions. To mention the penalties was to invite suspicion, to risk being labeled a sympathizer or worse, a traitor, a single misstep, a critical remark. Overheard by a political commissar, a failure to advance under fire, or even an imagined slight in a denunciation, could see a soldier stripped of rank, branded a devil of the people, enemy of the people, and consigned to the same fate as those he pitied. The fear of becoming a penalty was a specter that haunted every man in the Red Army, a reminder of the precariousness of their position under Stalin's regime. This fear, as much as discipline or patriotism, was the glue that held the Soviet war. Machined together, binding men to their duty with the unspoken threat of oblivion, the penalties were not just a military tool, but a psychological weapon, a warning to all that dissent or failure carried a price steeper than death: erasure. In the frozen trenches, where men huddled around smoldering fires fed by broken rifle stocks and scraps of paper, A young lieutenant, his fingers blackened by frostbite, scribbled a letter he knew would never reach its destination. His words, scratched in a trembling hand under the flicker of a candle stub, captured the anguish of witnessing the penalties' fate. Today I saw men die without names, without faith, without a flag to call their own. They called them traitors, yet not one turned and ran. Perhaps the real traitors are those who send them to their deaths. Such sentiments were dangerous, heretical in a system where loyalty was measured by obedience and survival was a privilege, not a right. The letter, like countless others, was intercepted by the NKVD's censors, its pages consigned to the flames of a brazier in some rear echelon command post. The lieutenant, if he survived the day, might find himself summoned before a commissar, his words twisted into evidence of disloyalty, his fate sealed with a transfer to the very battalions he mourned. The system was merciless, designed to crush not just resistance, but reflection, ensuring that the penalties remained a faceless, voiceless mass, their stories silenced before they could be told. The penalties left no physical legacy, no markers to testify to their existence. Their graves, when they existed at all, were shallow pits or mass trenches, hastily dug and quickly forgotten, their locations lost to the shifting tides of battle and the relentless advance of the Red Army. In places like the Donbass, Kursk, or the fields around Korsun-Cherkasy, where the penalties were thrown into the fiercest fighting, the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of their dead, veils filled with bodies so numerous that the ground quaked when tanks rolled over them. Veterans, those rare few who survived the war, whispered tales of entire battalions vanishing in a single night, their screams swallowed by the roar of artillery and the howl of the wind. These stories, passed in hushed tones around campfires or in the dim corners of vodka-soaked taverns, were all that remained of the penalties, fragments of oral history that the Soviet regime could not fully suppress, despite its best efforts. The NKVD archives, sealed and classified, buried any official record under layers of bureaucracy and denial, ensuring that the penal battalions remained a ghost in the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, a shadow cast by a state ashamed of its own cruelty. The penalties' fate was not merely death, but annihilation of identity, a punishment that extended beyond the grave. To die as a penalty was to be stripped of name, of history, of any claim to humanity. They were not soldiers but instruments, expended in charges against fortified positions or used to draw fire so regular units could advance. Their courage, if it could be called that, was born not of ideology, but of desperation, the primal urge to survive one more hour, one more assault, in the faint hope of earning a reprieve, a chance to redeem themselves through blood and return to a regular unit. Yet even this was a lie, for few survived long enough to claim such mercy, and those who did, often, carried the stigma of their service like a brand, shunned by comrades who saw in them a mirror of their own vulnerability. The true cost of this dishonor was not just the loss of life, but the obliteration of memory. The penalties fought, bled, and died in their thousands, their bodies paving the way for the Red Army's victories, yet they were denied even the smallest acknowledgement. No widow received a letter detailing their sacrifice. No child grew up with stories of a father's heroism. They were erased, their existence reduced to whispers in the wind, their legacy a cautionary tale told by those who dared to remember. In the end, the penalties were the ultimate victims of a war that consumed millions. Their deaths, not just a tragedy, but a deliberate act of forgetting, a price paid in blood and silence for the sin of being deemed unworthy by a regime that valued victory above all else. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the fields in a white shroud, it buried not just bodies, but the very idea that these men had ever lived, fought, or mattered, leaving only the wind to carry their story, a story that, despite every effort to silence it, refused to be entirely forgotten. In the unforgiving crucible of Stalin's Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War, where loyalty was a currency more volatile than gunpowder and trust a luxury no one could afford, even the most decorated heroes of the Red Army were not immune to the caprice of a regime that saw betrayal in every shadow. The Eastern Front, a sprawling theater of mud, blood and ice stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was not just a battleground against the German Wehrmacht, but a proving ground for the Soviet system's relentless paranoia. A general who had led his division to victory in the frozen forests of Finland in 1940, his chest adorned with the Order of the Red Star, could find himself stripped of rank and honor overnight, accused of incompetence or counter-revolutionary tendencies, based on a single misstep or an anonymous denunciation. A captain who risked his life to save a stranded platoon under a hail of German artillery might, in the blink of an eye, be branded a traitor for retreating 100 meters without explicit orders, his heroism erased by the stroke of a commissar's pen. For those who escaped the swift justice of a bullet to the back of the head in an NKVD cellar, a fate arguably more merciful, there awaited a punishment designed to grind their spirits into dust, consignment to the Shtrafniki, the Penal Battalions, where redemption was promised through blood. But survival was a cruel jest, and honor a distant memory. This was the doctrine of redemption through blood, a grim policy codified under Stalin's order, number 227, infamously known as Not One Step Back, which demanded that those who had failed the motherland atone for their sins by throwing themselves into the deadliest assignments of the war. Imagine a colonel, a veteran of the Winter War, his uniform once gleaming with the insignia of command, his name celebrated in divisional dispatches for outmaneuvering Finnish ski troops in the snows of Karelia. Now picture him reduced to a penalty, his medals torn from his chest, his name expunged from official records as if he had never existed. Clad in a tattered, lice-ridden greatcoat crusted with mud and dried blood, he trudged through the frozen steppe, no longer a leader, but a condemned man, indistinguishable from the thieves, deserters and political prisoners who formed the rank and file of the Penal Battalion. Men he might have once court-martialed for insubordination now stood shoulder to shoulder with him, their faces hollowed by hunger and fear, their hands clutching outdated Mosin Nagant rifles, or worse, nothing but shovels and picks. Yet he marched, driven not by loyalty to a regime that had betrayed him, but by a desperate hope that death in battle might restore some fragment of dignity to his name, or, at the very least, spare his family the stigma of being branded kin to a traitor of the people. The penalties officers were a paradox. Men trained to lead, stripped of authority, yet burdened with the same suicidal missions as their fellow condemned. Their stories, whispered in the flickering light of clandestine campfires or recorded in the margins of tattered notebooks that rarely survived the war, were tales of despair, cloaked in acts of reckless valor. Some threw themselves against German machine gun nests, clutching a single F1 grenade or a bundle of dynamite, not out of courage, but out of a soul-crushing need to end their torment on their own terms. These were not the heroic charges of propaganda posters, but acts of desperation, driven by the faint hope that an honorable death might persuade the Soviet state to spare their wives, children, or parents from the Gulag's maw, or the social ostracism reserved for the families of the disgraced. A lieutenant colonel, once the Erasure, architect of a daring flank attack that had routed a German battalion, might be seen sprinting alone toward a concrete bunker, his silhouette swallowed by the flash of an MG-42's muzzle, his sacrifice a silent plea that his son might one day attend school without the label sin of the enemy of the people, son of an enemy of the people, hanging over him like a curse. The Soviet system, however, was not built on forgiveness. The Strafbat was not a path to redemption, but a meat grinder, designed to extract the maximum utility from men deemed expendable. Officers who survived one hellish assault, crawling through minefields laced with tripwires, fording rivers so cold that men froze midstream, or charging headlong into curtains of German artillery, were rarely released from their sentence. Instead, they were sent back again and again to face the same horrors until death claimed them or their unit was annihilated. A major, for instance, whose only crime was retreating 10 meters to save his company from encirclement, found himself condemned to a penal battalion after a summary tribunal. His file, buried in the labyrinthine archives of the NKVD, noted with chilling brevity, transferred to penal unit for indefinite term due to cowardice. He lasted 5 days. 5 days of unrelenting terror, leading charges across fields sown with S-mines that erupted in geysers of shrapnel, wading through icy streams under the crosshairs of German snipers, and storming fortified positions with nothing but a bayonet and a tattered red flag clutched in his hands. When he fell, shot through the chest while planting that flag in a futile gesture of defiance, he was still trying to prove his loyalty to a system that had already discarded him. His body, like thousands of others, was left where it lay, the flag trampled into the mud by the next wave of attackers, his name erased from history as thoroughly as his blood soaked into the Ukrainian soil. The regular Red Army officers, those who still held their ranks and wore their insignia with a mixture of pride and dread, watched this spectacle in a silence born of self-preservation. They knew the fragility of their own positions in a system where failure was equated with betrayal and loyalty was no guarantee of safety. A single botched operation, perhaps a mission doomed from the start by unrealistic orders from Moscow, could see a regimental commander demoted to the Shtrafbat. A misplaced word, a glance interpreted as insubordination by a zealous commissar or a denunciation from a rival, could transform a hero into a pariah overnight. The NKVD's shadow loomed over every command post, its agents ever present, their notebooks filled with names and suspicions. Officers learned to speak in measured tones, to avoid questioning orders, no matter how suicidal, and to suppress any flicker of empathy for the penalties they saw marching to their deaths. To show pity was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was the first step toward the same fate. This was discipline, forged not by camaraderie or ideology, but by terror. A system where fear was the mortar binding the Red Army's ranks, ensuring that every man, from general to private, understood the price of failure. In the long, frigid nights of the Eastern Front, where temperatures plummeted to 25 degrees and the wind howled through shattered villages, the penalties gathered around small, furtive fires, their flames carefully shielded to avoid drawing German artillery. In these fleeting moments of respite, they shared their stories, not as comrades but as ghosts, clinging to the remnants of their former selves. "I was a captain," one might whisper, his voice barely audible over the crackle of burning twigs, recounting a time when he led a company across the Volga. "I was a major," another would murmur, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he recalled commanding a battery of 76mm guns at Kharkov. "I was a hero," a third might say, his voice breaking as he spoke of a medal pinned to his chest by a general now long dead. These confessions, spoken in the darkness, were acts of defiance, a refusal to let the regime erase their past entirely. Yet they were also acts of futility, for in the Shtrafbat, rank was irrelevant, and all were equal in their condemnation. The only title that mattered was penalty, and the only path forward was a gauntlet of blood and snow, where survival was measured in hours and redemption was a promise rarely kept. The penalties officers carried the weight of their former lives like a chain, their training and instincts at odds with their new reality. A colonel who once pored over maps in a heated command tent now crawled through barbed wire, his hands raw and bleeding, leading men he barely knew into battles he knew they could not win. A lieutenant, once responsible for the lives of a platoon, now found himself ordered to clear a minefield by walking through it, his survival dependent on luck rather than skill. Their expertise, honed over years of service, was wasted in the penal battalions, where strategy was replaced by brute sacrifice and leadership meant being the first to die. Yet some clung to their old habits, organizing their ragtag squads with a semblance of military order, barking commands as if they still wore their epaulets, if only to preserve a shred of dignity in the face of annihilation. Others succumbed to despair, their spirits broken by the realization that their lives, once valued, were now mere currency to be spent in the service of a regime that had already judged them worthless. The archives of the Red Army, sealed behind the Iron Curtain of Soviet bureaucracy, offer only fleeting glimpses of these men's fates. A report from the Second Ukrainian Front in early 1944 mentions a former regimental commander, demoted for failure to hold a defensive line, who led a Shtrafbat assault against a German strongpoint near Korsun. His unit, tasked with capturing a fortified hill, was cut down by enfilading fire from MG-42s and 88mm flak guns, their bodies left tangled in the barbed wire like marionettes with severed strings. The report notes laconically, "Objective not taken, unit expended." Another document records a captain accused of defeatist talk after questioning the feasibility of an attack, who survived 3 penal missions before being killed by a German sniper while attempting to rescue a wounded penalty. His death warranted a single line: liquidated, in action. These fragments, buried in classified files, are the closest thing to memorials these men would ever receive, their stories reduced to bureaucratic footnotes in a war that glorified collective triumph over individual sacrifice. The penalties officers, like their enlisted counterparts, left no monuments, no graves marked with their names. Their bodies, when not abandoned on the battlefield, were thrown into mass pits, their remains indistinguishable from those of the criminals and deserters they fought alongside. Yet their presence lingered in the whispered tales of survivors, in the memories of regular soldiers who watched them charge into the inferno and wondered at the system that could so casually destroy its own. The Strafbat was not just a punishment but a warning, a demonstration of the Soviet state's power to rewrite a man's life, to transform a hero into a condemned soul with a single accusation. For these officers, the true dishonor was not the loss of rank or the stripping of medals, but the erasure of their humanity, the reduction of their lives to a currency of blood spent without remorse. As they marched into the snow, their silhouettes fading against the gray horizon, they carried with them the weight of a nation's betrayal, a nation that demanded their sacrifice, yet refused them even the dignity of a name. As dawn broke over the Eastern Front in early 1944, a shroud of fog clung to the frozen Ukrainian steppe, its ghostly tendrils curling around. The scarred landscape like the breath of some malevolent spirit. The air was thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder, a bitter prelude to the carnage that awaited. In the distance, the German artillery roared, a deep, metallic thunder that rolled across the fields, shaking the earth and rattling the bones of the men huddled in their makeshift trenches. The Soviet soldiers, or rather the condemned souls of the Strafbat, the penal battalions, waited in a tense, shivering silence, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by fear and exhaustion. These were not the disciplined ranks of the Red Army's regular divisions, but a ragged assembly of outcasts, former Gulag prisoners convicted of petty crimes or political dissent, deserters who had fled one battle only to be thrust into a worse one, and disgraced officers stripped of rank for offenses real or imagined. Their uniforms, if they could be called that, were patched and filthy, caked with the frozen mud of the steppe and the blood of previous assaults. Then, from the rear, a political commissar, his greatcoat emblazoned with the red star, raised his arm, a stark, unambiguous signal that needed no explanation. No rousing speeches stirred their hearts, no promises of glory or survival were offered. Only a single chilling command cut through the wind's howl: Avanjar. advance. Thus began another penal offensive, a grim ritual of sacrifice that would come to define the Soviet war machine's brutal efficiency. From the trenches erupted a human tide, thousands of penalties, a swarm of desperate men driven not by patriotism, but by the primal instinct to survive the next few minutes. Their boots sank into the frozen lamina, each step a struggle against the sucking grip of mud and ice, their breaths forming fleeting clouds of vapor that mingled with the smoke of distant artillery barrages. They ran, stumbled, fell and rose again, their movements jerky and frantic, propelled by a terror greater than the enemy ahead. The NKVD blocking, detachments stationed behind them, their PPSH-41 submachine guns leveled, ready to cut down any man who dared to falter. The penalties were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but a living battering ram, expendable fodder sent to overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers and relentless momentum. Their advance was not a charge, but a flood, a wave of humanity breaking against the fortified lines of the Wehrmacht, with the inevitability of a tide against a crumbling shore. Ahead lay the Inferno, a killing ground meticulously prepared by the German defenders of the Korsun-Cherkassy salient. The Wehrmacht's MG-42 machine guns, their barrels cooled and loaded with belts of 7.90 T2mm ammunition, waited in concrete bunkers and camouflaged emplacements, their gunners peering through slits with the calm precision of hunters. Panzer IV tanks, their turrets swiveling with mechanical menace, stood ready with canister rounds to shred infantry at close range, while 80mm flak guns, repurposed for anti-personnel slaughter, loomed on the ridges, their muzzles trained on the open fields. Anti-personnel mines, S-mines, or bouncing Bettys, designed to leap a meter into the air before exploding in a storm of shrapnel, lay hidden in the snow, their tripwires invisible until it was too late. As the first wave of penalties came within 200 meters, the German gunners found their range, and the world dissolved into chaos. The MG-42s opened fire, their cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, producing a sound like ripping canvas, a continuous bone-shaking roar that seemed to shred the fabric of time itself. Bullets tore through the air like swarms of enraged hornets, cutting men down in mid-stride, their bodies jerking backward as if yanked by invisible strings, limbs severed, torsos ripped open, blood spraying in crimson arcs that froze before they hit the ground. The first wave collapsed almost instantly, a carpet of corpses piling in the snow, their forms twisted into grotesque parodies of life. Some clutching useless rifles, others grasping at wounds that pumped their lifeblood into the earth. Yet behind them came another wave, and another, an unrelenting surge of men driven forward by the screams of commissars and the threat of NKVD bullets. The penalties advanced over the bodies of their fallen comrades, using the dead as makeshift cover, crouching behind heaps of mangled flesh to avoid the relentless fire. The ground became a quagmire of blood, mud, and shattered equipment, littered with discarded rifles, shredded greatcoats, and the debris of human lives, fingers, boots, and shards of bone scattered like grim confetti. Grenades exploded in deafening claps, sending geysers of earth and body parts skyward, while mortar rounds rained down, their concussions flattening men into the craters they sought for shelter. The air was choked with the stench of cordite, burning flesh, and the metallic tang of blood, a miasma so thick it coated the throat and stung the eyes. Yet the penalties pressed on, some armed only with bayonets fixed to empty rifles, others wielding entrenching tools as makeshift clubs, their faces contorted with a mixture of rage, fear, and the madness of men who knew they were already dead. The commissars, positioned safely behind the lines, drove the assault with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. "Don't stop! Advance, you damn bastards!" they bellowed, their voices hoarse over the din of battle, their pistols drawn to emphasize. The command, the NKVD blocking units, known as barrier troops, formed an impassable wall at the rear, their machine guns trained not on the Germans, but on their own men. Order number 227 had made retreat a death sentence, and the penalties understood their predicament with brutal clarity. Death awaited them ahead in the German lines, and death awaited them behind if they faltered. There was no choice, no retreat, no surrender, only the relentless push forward into the maelstrom. A man might step on, an S-mine, his body obliterated in a flash of fire and steel, his scream cut short as the blast scattered his remains across the field. Another, hit by shrapnel from a 75mm shell, might crawl forward, dragging himself with bleeding stumps where fingers once were, his rifle clutched in a futile gesture of defiance. Some, driven beyond reason, ran screaming into the hail of bullets, their voices lost in the cacophony, their bodies piling up in windrows that marked the high tide of each failed. Advance, yet in a brutal miracle born of sheer numbers and desperation, the human wave sometimes achieved what strategy could not. Meter by blood-soaked meter, the penalties closed the distance, their bodies absorbing the German fire until the defenders' barrels glowed red and their ammunition belts ran low. As the leading edge of the wave reached the German trenches, the battle devolved into a primal, visceral struggle, a whirlwind of blood, steel, and mud. Bayonets clashed with a metallic screech, men grappling hand to hand in the confines of the trenches, their breaths mingling as they stabbed and clubbed with whatever they held. A penalty might drive his bayonet into a German gunner's chest, only to be felled by a spade swung by another defender. Officers, their former ranks meaningless, fought like berserkers, their torn uniforms indistinguishable from those of the criminals beside them, their shouts of rage blending with the guttural cries of the condemned. The German lines, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of bodies and the ferocity of men with nothing to lose, began to buckle. Not through tactical brilliance, but through the raw, chaotic force of human desperation. A bunker might fall, its defenders overrun, their bodies buried under the tide of attackers, but the cost was staggering. For every meter gained, dozens lay dead, their sacrifice measured in the fleeting breach of a single trench. When the firing finally ceased, the battlefield was a charnel house, a smoking graveyard where the snow was stained red and black, the air heavy with the reek of death. The ground was littered with the wreckage of the assault, shattered rifles, twisted helmets, and bodies so mangled they seemed less human than debris. Among the carnage, a handful of penalties survived, staggering like phantoms through the haze, their faces caked with blood and dirt, their eyes vacant with the shock of survival. Some collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to move, their breaths shallow in the freezing air. Behind them, the commissar, his greatcoat pristine compared to the bloodied rags of the men he commanded, scribbled in his notebook with clinical detachment, "Objective secured. Losses acceptable." The words, scrawled in haste, belied the scale of the slaughter. Hundreds, perhaps thousands dead to capture a few hundred meters of worthless ground. A victory counted not in strategic gain, but in the exhaustion of the enemy's bullets. These were the human waves of the Red Army, a tactic as old as war itself, but refined to a horrific art by the Soviet war machine. There was no brilliance in their execution, no elegant maneuvers or cunning stratagems, just the relentless sacrifice of men deemed disposable, fuel for the fire of victory. The penalties were not soldiers, but instruments, their lives expended to clog the gears of the German defenses, to force the enemy to expend ammunition and energy on waves of attackers who kept coming until the line broke, or the last man fell. The spectacle was both awe-inspiring and appalling, a testament to the Soviet Union's willingness to spend lives as freely as shells, to turn men into a currency of war. The penalties advanced not for glory or ideology, but because they had no other choice, caught between the enemy's guns and their own. Their deaths a grim necessity in a war that measured success in blood. The human wave was the inferno in motion, a rolling tide of suffering that left behind only silence and the unmarked graves of the forgotten, their sacrifice the price of a victory that would never bear their names. As the human waves advance, behind them there is a silent and relentless presence. Men of the NKVD, armed with cold eyes, they watch every step. They are not there to fight the enemy. They are there to ensure that no one, absolutely no one, escapes the fate imposed on them. The order is simple. Anyone who retreats will be shot immediately. The Shtrafniki feel their presence like a constant shadow. A shot from behind, a suspicious look, and the body falls without glory. There is no appeal, there is no mercy. The fear these officers spread is as intense as that of the German death ahead. In the midst of the battle, as grenades explode and bodies fly through the air, the NKVD commissars move silently. They watch, timing every hesitation, every step that shouldn't have been taken. And when someone hesitates, execution is instantaneous, a short, accurate shot that cuts off life, without ceremony. Terror is not just physical, it's psychological, penetrating. The soldier who runs in fear of enemy death now carries the weight of a new invisible enemy, their own countrymen. And it is this tension that keeps the Shtrafniki moving forward, even when their flesh screams and their lungs burn. The presence of the NKVD also serves to reinforce a brutal lesson. Dishonor is more terrible than death, and the state never forgives. Many regular soldiers watch this with a mixture of horror and resignation. They know that if they waver, if they hesitate, the same fate awaits them. And so, war turns into a triple horror theater. Ahead, the relentless enemy. At the rear, the country's own executioners. And in the middle, the Shtrafniki, human cannon fodder, advancing not for glory, but for simple desire to survive one more minute. Every advance, every step over the blood of dead colleagues reinforces a cruel truth. On the Stalingrad, Erasure or Voronezh front, Soviet discipline was maintained by absolute fear, and the NKVD was the invisible executioner who ensured that no one escaped the appointed death. The battlefield is not just made of bullets and grenades, it is made of icy snow that seeps into boots, of mud that sticks to the skin and freezes the muscles, of rivers that flow almost solidly, and of the cutting wind that turns breath into sharp blades. The Shtrafniki know this pain every day. There are no heated tents, no clean clothes, and not enough food. The daily ration is minimal. Sometimes just a piece of stale bread and cloudy water, distributed unevenly, while the officers eat what is left. And when hunger strikes, the cold penetrates to the bones, making each step a Herculean effort. Many soldiers collapse from exhaustion before they even reach enemy lines. Others stumble over bodies, frozen corpses that blend into the snow and continue marching as if they were part of the landscape. The cold, the mud, and the hunger kill as much as German machine guns. On moonless nights, they huddle around small makeshift fires, trying to keep warm with whatever they can find, soaked firewood or the remains of wood burned by the bombings. But even heat is temporary. When the sun rises, it reveals again destroyed trenches, mangled bodies, and the grey, hopeless landscape. Ice seeps into bones, mud sticks to wounded bodies, and an empty stomach screams louder than the fear of death. And yet, they advance, driven by fear of the NKVD and Stalin's decree, not a step back. War at this point is not just a fight against the enemy, it is a test of extreme human endurance. Every meter gained, every bullet fired, every step on the frozen snow is an act of desperate survival, but also of punishment. Punishment for past mistakes, punishment for simply existing. And so the Shtrafnik quickly learns, it is not just the enemy that kills, not just the bullet that goes through the body. It is hunger, mud, cold, exhaustion, the world itself turned into an enemy. They march, stumble, fall, get up and carry on, because hell on earth does not forgive, and death only comes after you get tired of fighting. In the midst of this sea of blood, mud and snow, some men stand out, not for honor or medals, but by the sheer need to survive. They quickly learn that any hesitation is deadly. With every step, every shot, every deflected grenade, they become forced heroes, fighting not for glory, but to see the next dawn. A young soldier, previously accused of desertion, finds himself facing an enemy machine gun that threatens to decimate his unit. Without thinking, he runs into the line of fire, throwing grenades and shooting with whatever he has. If it survives, it will not be celebrated. If you fall, no one will write your name. Still, he runs, because there is no choice, only the need to exist one more minute. Another officer, once decorated, organizes wounded men for an impromptu advance. He uses pieces of wood as sticks to point directions, redistributes weapons among the survivors, and keeps the line cohesive. His leadership is not recognized. There is no official report nor medal on his chest. But at that moment, survival depends on your courage. The Shtrafniki learn to finding strength in despair. With each offensive, they discover they can go further than they imagined, that can cross minefields, withstand machine gun fire, and continue marching on the blood of their friends. And yet the paradox is cruel. That courage does not belong to them. It is not voluntary, it is not honorable, it is imposed by hunger, cold, the threat of the NKVD and Stalin's decree, not a step back. At the end of each battle, the survivors crawl into makeshift trenches, look at the dead, and breathe, tired, frozen, blooded. And they know that for the world, they were never heroes. They will never be remembered in the history books. But, at that moment, every breath is a small victory. Proof that even though they are condemned, they are still alive. War transforms them, hardens their bodies and souls. They become survival machines, capable of feats that normal men could not achieve, but always with the shadow of death hovering, reminding them that every act of heroism is just another day bought with blood. The cold is biting, the mud is thick, and the enemy artillery gives no respite. But now comes the most critical moment, the complete breaking of the siege. The Shtrafniki are sent to the front, not as ordinary soldiers, but as human, cannon fodder, paving the way for those who still have a chance to survive. Men know there is no time to waste. Cold, hunger, and injuries have reduced many to shadows of their former selves. But there is no choice, only forward, through fields littered with craters, barbed wire, and the bodies of those who came before. Ahead, the enemy awaits with machine guns, rifles, and grenades. A single shot can take down dozens, but the progress does not stop. Men stumble, fall, are dragged through the mud, or hit by shrapnel. Some rise only to carry on, driven by fear of the rearguard, the NKVD officers ready to fire at any retreat. The noise is deafening. The sky lights up with explosions, black smoke and fire that tears across the horizon. Each enemy trench that is conquered costs the lives of dozens of convicts, but miraculously, some gaps begin to appear, and it is in this chaos between death and destruction that hope arises. Regular soldiers take advantage of the gaps opened by the Shtrafniki and advance. The siege, which seemed insurmountable, begins to give way. The goal isn't heroism, it's survive and save those who still have a chance to escape. And as the survivors watch the bodies of their comrades strewn across the field, they understand the cruel truth. Every step forward was bought with the blood of hundreds. Victory is bitter, survival an act of absolute desperation. The siege is broken, but the memory of what happened will not be forgotten by those who lived. The hell they went through, the waves of humanity, the terror of the NKVD, the hunger, the mud, and the cold, all of this left a deep impression. And even among the few survivors, the trauma, pain, and guilt will be remembered forever. Few survived. Out of hundreds, sometimes thousands, sent to the front as cannon fodder, only a few men emerged from the inferno intact, or as close to it as possible. They return not as heroes, but as ghosts, carrying invisible scars and nightmares no one could understand. Each survivor carries in their mind the sight of colleagues shattered in the snow, the sound of machine guns cutting through the air, the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood and mud. Trauma knows no bounds. Some cannot speak without trembling. Others scream in the night, reliving every explosion and every shot that nearly killed them. Survivor's guilt, the feeling that others died in your place, slowly eats away at the soul. Upon returning to regular lines, many are still treated with suspicion. Bitap, state rarely recognizes their sacrifice. There are no medals, there is no glory. The only thing left for them is the silence and the weight of having seen death up close in its most absolute and cruel form. But paradoxically, these surviving men become the greatest teachers of endurance and hardening of the Soviet army. They carry experiences that no training could teach: how to advance under almost certain fire, how to maintain discipline with death looming over every step, and how to fight, even when the body begs for rest. The outside world will never see what they went through. Stories are censored, names are erased. But in their memory, every battle, every human wave, every NKVD execution is recorded in gory detail, reminding them that surviving was just the first challenge. Living with the weight of memory is the second. And so the surviving Shtrafniki carry with them the burden of history, silent testimonies of a war in which fear, punishment, and blood were the forces that shaped the destiny of the homeland. The war is over, but the echo of human waves still resounds across the frozen plains of Russia. The penal battalions, created to wash away the guilt with blood, have officially disappeared from the records. But the impact of their actions remains, etched in the memories of survivors, in the accounts of veterans, and in the secret files that are only now beginning to emerge. Historically, the Shtrafniki represent a brutal face of Soviet warfare, a demonstration that in times of absolute despair, a man's life could be considered disposable. They were sent to death like human tides, without glory, without recognition, but with a strategic effect that not all generals would dare admit. For historians, they are examples of extreme sacrifice, forced courage, and collective punishment. For the public, they are stories that impress and shock, remembering that war is not just about tactics and battles, but also about extreme human suffering and cruel choices, imposed by the state. And for the few survivors, the legacy is twofold. They live to tell stories that no one wanted to hear, but that deserve to be remembered. They bear physical and psychological scars, memories of friends who disappeared, of human waves that crumbled into the snow, of officers and commissioners who imposed fear as law. The outside world rarely acknowledged their suffering, but history, the real one, uncensored, unglorified, shows that Soviet penal battalions were sent to a hell designed by the state itself, and that even in the midst of madness and death, some men survived, carrying with them a silent, terrible, and unforgettable testimony. In the end, the Shtrafniki's legacy is a warning. In wars where despair reigns, human blood can be used as currency of victory, and the memory of those who died is often lost in the cold pages of history. But for those who dare to look closely, the hell they faced can never be forgotten.